Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlights series. Today we're going to focus on Benchmark 1.9, describe how the U.S. Constitution limits the powers of government through separation of powers, checks and balances, individual rights, rule of law, and the due process of law. In Part 1, we focus on limiting government power through separation of powers and checks and balances. We'll be looking at explaining the concept of limited government in the U.S. Constitution, describing and distinguishing between separation of powers and checks and balances, and analyzing how government power is limited by separation of powers and/or checks and balances. I'd like us to look at this quote that has been attributed to either Alexander Hamilton or James Madison, Federalist 51. Federalist 51 is one of the 85 Federalist Papers, and it is one of the most widely cited and widely read of those 85 papers. In essence, what the author outlines in Federalist 51 is the concept of limited government as presented in the U.S. Constitution. As a bit of background, it is important to note that the Federalist Papers were written in 1787 and in the early months of 1788 with the purpose of convincing the state of New York to ratify the proposed Constitution. In essence, the state of New York was so powerful that it could somehow or possibly prevent other states from ratifying or present other kinds of concerns. So if the state of New York legislature could be convinced to go along with the proposed Constitution, then so too would the other smaller states surrounding New York. So we need to keep that in mind, that when we're looking at the concept of limited government as presented in the Constitution through this document, in essence, we're looking at a document that is intended to persuade a state that might otherwise be discouraged from supporting the new document. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So let's look at the metaphor of the angel. Why would the author focus on an angel? The idea is that angels are without sin. They don't have bad thoughts. They don't have bad actions. They're not greedy. They don't have a strong desire for power, especially at the expense of someone else. And so what the author is saying is that if men had the same thoughts and motivations as angels, there would be no reason to set up a government. In essence, what a government does is to make sure that the right things happen in society. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. That means that if the angels were in charge, then that means that the angels would make certain that the people who were in the government would always do the right thing, would not abuse their power. However, there are no angels that are either governing men, nor are men angels, meaning if it's we the people who are governing ourselves, meaning a government which is to be administered by men over men, then we have a problem, we have a challenge. because first the government must be able to control the governed, and in the next place, make sure that that government doesn't get out of control, abusing its power as well. So it's important to oblige the government to control itself. So the concept of limited government is that we are human beings, we have our faults, we have our frailties, we have our desires, and consequently, we must have structures in place to help us control ourselves from abusing our power if we hold a position in government. Next, we're going to look at the difference between separation of powers and checks and balances. Separation of powers and checks and balances are often used in the same sentence, but they're not the same thing. Separation of powers means that the legislative powers are separate from the executive powers, which are separate from the judicial powers. But a mere separation of powers doesn't prevent a single branch from abusing its own power. Checks and balances focuses on the interaction between the separated powers. And the interaction between the separated powers is that each branch may be limited in how it exercises its power by at least one other branch. That is checks and balances. So the legislature can play a role in controlling the executive and the judicial branch, but at the same time, the judicial branch and the executive branch also can play a role in controlling what the Congress does, what the legislative branch does. Thus, in order to control the government, you not only separate powers so that the same people are not enforcing the laws that they've just passed, but you also create checks and balances, which further reinforces limiting the power of government. So how is government power limited by separation of powers and checks and balances? Well, we're going to be looking at some examples that help us to distinguish between separation of powers and checks and balances. The U.S. Constitution, Article 1, gives to Congress the power to override a presidential veto. What this means is that Congress passes a law, sends it to the president. The president can say yes or can say no. When the president says no, that's called a veto. But Congress can override the president's veto with 2/3 of each house of Congress voting to override. That is an example of checks and balances. Another example of a limitation. The U.S. House of Representatives chooses the Speaker of the House. This is an example of separation of powers because it is a power that is exclusively held by the U.S. House of Representatives. The U.S. Senate, the President, or the courts, no one can check what the House does when they are choosing their Speaker. The U.S. Constitution says that the House shall choose their Speaker, which means that the Speaker of the House can be anybody who is otherwise qualified to hold public office, meaning a U.S. citizen adult. The person doesn't need to be a member of Congress. The person doesn't need to have any experience as an elected official. Therefore, this power is exclusive to the U.S. House of Representatives. That is an example of separation of powers. The U.S. Constitution also gives to the President the power to deliver the State of the Union address. Now, the State of the Union address is generally an annual address, but the Constitution does not give any type of frequency as to how often the State of the Union may be given. So a president may decide not to give a State of the Union address, or a president may decide to give several State of the Union addresses in the same year. That's completely up to the president. And because it's completely up to the president, this is an example of separation of powers. And then the last example we're going to look at is the U.S. Supreme Court may overturn acts of Congress. This is an example of checks and balances because the U.S. Supreme Court has the power to decide something that was done in another branch of government, meaning the legislative branch, saying that a law that the Congress passed is not consistent with the Constitution, and therefore that law may not be implemented. Thank you for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. Do you still have questions? If so, please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.